Is loud better? The first time I really remember listening to music loud was with my first Walkman. My dad owned a bar in Gillam, Manitoba, and someone had forgotten the yellow Sony brand Sport Walkman of the 80s at a table after a night of boozing it. The next few days, no one came back to claim the Walkman, so I inherited it, including a mixtape that had Patio Lanterns by Kim Mitchell on it. As I was rocking out, I kept inching up the volume louder and louder till it was as loud as it could possibly go. I'm not quite sure why loud music got me so excited, but it did. Turning to the internet for the answers to the many questions in life, I found that there is something in the inner ear called the sacculus. This magic tiny body part has direct connection to the pleasure centers in the brain and releases endorphins when stimulated by loud music. The sacculus particularly likes low frequencies below 80 hertz that are loud or above 90 decibels, to be an audio nerd about it. This is maybe a clue to why EDM and doing tons of drugs is such a fun pastime for so many people. I think the next time I really experienced loud was when I started going to concerts. I remember seeing Propaganda at Le Rendezvous, a club that used to be in the St. Boniface area of Winnipeg. When I got back home after the show and laid down to go to sleep, my ears were ringing like crazy. It was easily the loudest thing I had ever heard up to that point. It wasn't very long after I started going to concerts that my first band, Lacking Intelligence, started playing out. There was a bit of a chip on the shoulder of the lucky bands that could afford a half-stack guitar amp. A stack was kind of the unofficial mark of a serious band. You knew if they were committed enough to toss it all in for a giant amp, they must be good. Or at least loud. I didn't quite get to start there. However, I was lucky enough that my first real guitar amp was a Marshall. When I say real guitar amp, I mean as in one that wasn't able to just fit in a backpack. A local music shop in North Kildonan, the area of Winnipeg where I grew up, had a Marshall JCM 800 Super Lead combo amp for sale. It was awesome. 50 watts, it had 2 channels, so I could have a clean tone and a distorted tone. It was heavy as fuck, but fit perfect on a skateboard, which was actually how I got it home after I bought it. I was 17 years old at the time and didn't have access to a car. However, I feel I was more resourceful than the average teenager, and between a short bus ride and push on my New Deal deck, it was home safe. I rocked that amp for years. However, the real dream was to own a half stack. It took a bit of saving, but I finally bought a brand new JCM 900 1960 lead 4x12 cab, brand new from Mother's Music. I used the JCM 800 as a head for a while, but eventually a previously owned JCM 900 high gain dual reverb 50 watt head came across the table. It was everything I wanted in an amp. It had 2 channels which shared EQ, but different gain knobs, so I could again have a clean tone and a distorted tone. The gain on the lead channel went to 20, so I had no problem having plenty of crunch on the chugs. But when did Marshall start? I'm sure it wasn't the first amp company by far, right? Maybe it's time for a deep dive. Jim Marshall went into business in 1962 after years of a successful career as a drummer and drum teacher. Yep. The founder of one of the top guitar amp companies in the world was a drummer. I'll just let the drummers relish in that for a moment as the guitar players shake their heads in disbelief. Jim had a small shop in Hanwell, London, selling drums, cymbals, and drumming-related accessories. But wait a sec, how do you go from a drummer to building amps? Maybe we gotta go back in time a bit farther. James Charles Marshall was born July 23rd, 1923, and came from a musical family. As a child, he was diagnosed with tubercular bones, an infectious disease, and spent much of his childhood in the hospital, missing out on school. Luckily, he was pretty bright, and as he entered adulthood, ended up working as an electrical engineer by day and a singer by night. Due to his poor health, Jim was exempt from being drafted into the forces during World War II. Also because of the war, musicians were in short supply, so he had to double as the drummer as well as the singer in his band. Jim didn't have a particularly powerful voice, so built himself a portable PA cabinet so his singing could be heard over the drums. Again, being war times, everything was in short supply, including gas for his car, so Jim Marshall had to ride his bike to the gigs, pulling a trailer with a drum kit and his homemade PA in tow. As the war came to a close, Jim had made a bit of a name for himself as a drummer and had something like around 65 students he was teaching. Mitch Mitchell, who drummed for Jimi Hendrix, and Mickey Waller, who played with Little Richie, were among his students. Outside of teaching, Jim was still gigging at night as well, and boasted an income of £5,000 a year, which by today's standards is nearly 250,000 USD. It was through that bling bling he was able to open the drum shop in Hanwell, and I think we are somewhat caught up in the story. Back to the early 60s, Richie Blackmore of Deep Purple, Big Jim Sullivan, a session dude, and Pete Townsend of The Who were hanging out at Jim Marshall's shop all the time, complaining about a bunch of guitar player problems. Number 1, none of the amps are ever loud enough. Number 2, if you wanted several different guitar sounds, you needed several different amps. Number 3, Fender amps were super expensive to bring in from the USA. I'm sure there were more complaints, but those are the main ones to advance the plot of the story. The three rock stars eventually talked Jim into developing an amp based on their critiques. Although Marshall was somewhat deadly with the soldering iron, he enlisted the help of his shop repair person, Ken Braun, and Dudley Craven, an EMI Electronics apprentice and electrical genius. Ken Underwood was also involved, although it's vague what his area of expertise was in the whole project. Nonetheless, the awesome threesome got to work basing their prototype on the Fender Bassman. Dudley tried the 6v6 valves that were used in the Fender model, but wasn't happy with the results. They upgraded to the 6L6s, along with the ECC8 preamp valves and the GZ34 high voltage rectifier valve. All these numbers and letters added up to the Marshall sound, as coined by Jim Marshall himself. A few weeks into production, the 6L6s were replaced by the EL34s, which were equivalent to the 6L6s, but with higher output and were much more rugged. Even more intense valves like KT66s and eventually KT88s like I had in my JCM900 head came later in 1965-66-ish. Few speakers could handle more than 15 watts at the time, which was why the Fender Bassman had the 4 Jensen speakers to distribute the 50 watts of rock. Marshall chose to go with the Celestion brand. Tube talk and speaker mumbo jumbo aside, the amp was tested September 1963 at a local bar show, with Jim's son Terry on sax and Mitch playing the drums. Oddly, the person wasn't documented, it seems, who actually played the amp, so maybe they kinda sucked a guitar or something and were worth forgetting. Sorry, person. The next Monday morning, an excited Pete Townsend purchased the first Marshall amp for £110, which is worth almost £2,500 in today's money, or nearly 3,500 USD. The amp was called JTM 45, named after Jim and Terry Marshall, and 45 because it was 45 watts. Although actually probably put out closer to 50. The amps were a hit. Dudley eventually quit EMI Electronics to come work for Jim full-time. By 1965, Pete wanted yet even more volume, and Dudley and the Kens doubled down on the bet with a 100-watt amp head and an 8x12 cabinet. I was able to find this shot that might have been the 8x12 cab, but Pete eventually got talked into 2 4x12 cabinets that could stack one on top of the other. Dudley and the Kens doubled the output tubes and added larger transformers all around. That was pretty much the birth of the Marshall Super Lead and the Marshall Stack. 1966, Jimi Hendrix had caught word of the crazy awesome new amps and came to visit Jim's shop to try a few out. After some rad riffagery, Jimmy bought an amp at retail price, as long as his road crew could be trained on how to fix the thing, just in case it blew up on the road. 1973, to streamline production, labor-intensive hand wiring was discontinued, and Marshall amps switched to printed circuit boards, or PCBs. PCBs are the basis of modern electronics and are in everything from a smartwatch to a garage door opener. These days, you can actually place an order online, and one of hundreds of companies in China will print off a small batch of circuit boards of your design for like $10 a board. Marshall continued to diversify its products through the 70s and 80s, 70s, always figuring out new ways to get more tone and crunch out of their amps. Rick Reinschens and Tony Frank were two guys working for Unicord, an American company that distributed Marshall amps in the USA in the 60s and 70s. They seemed to be the ones that had the idea for the dual volume control. The mods were intended to replicate the sound of the earlier non-MV Marshalls with the master volume set low. However, players quickly realized that cranking the MV of these new Marshall amps would yield even more overdrive distortion for a more edgy, chunky, cutting tone. Randy Rhoads, Zakk Wylde, and Slash were all part of the fan club of these amps. 1987 was a milestone for Marshall amps and Jim Marshall himself. 25 years in the amp business and 50 years in music. A silver Jubilee Series amp based on the JCM 800 was released to celebrate. The silver amp could be switched from 25 to 50 watts depending on how loud you want to go, but not compromising tone. JCM 800 actually got its name from Jim's initials and the number on the license plate of his car. The 90s and 2000s saw other companies like Mesa Boogie and Soldano enter the game with high-gain amps. Marshall didn't want to get left in the dust, so they introduced the JCM 900, which was the amp I had, and the JCM 2000 series. The 2000 series featured dual super lead and triple super lead models. 3 totally independent channels with full separate EQ and gain. You could get 3 totally different tones out of the same amp and perhaps slightly improve your tap dancing moves as you attempt to operate the foot switch that came with it. 2016, Marshall entered the digital amp modeling game with the Code series amps. Definitely a cool concept to be able to mix and match amps and amp components. With the push of a button, you can change the preamps, power amp, cabinet, etc. to really fine-tune the sound you're searching for. An app is downloadable for your smartphone called Marshall Gateway to interact with the amp settings rather than using the tiny monochrome screen on the amp itself. The Code series has 24 onboard effects, so you can toss out that giant pedal board that hums like crazy and never works properly anyways. Like anything computerish, there have been reports of trouble connecting the amp with the app, amp with the app, amp with the app. Say that 5 times fast. Also reports of crazy artifacts and other odd sounds that can invade your sessions unexpectedly. Marshall has been a symbol of rock, rad guitar tone, and loud for almost 50 years at the time I made this video. My JCM 900 cab and head went across the country in a beat-up old van dozens of times. They got dropped a few times, torn out of a freezing cold van in the middle of winter to be shoved on stage and played at max volume immediately, only then to be shoved back in the van and rattled around for another 100 miles on the way to the next gig. I rarely had any issues with any of the gear. I can't speak for some of the new stuff from personal experience, but the Marshall name was always dependable every time I plugged in and rocked out with one of their amps. I regret having to sell my head when times were tough financially, but if I ever find myself buying another amp, it would probably be the first name I would check out.